You do not need to become younger to be loved by a younger man, but you must become more deeply yourself. This is not just about age, it's about energy, it's about clarity. In a world that encourages performance, especially for women who feel the weight of age, it's easy to fall into a subtle fear. If I don't adjust, I might be left behind. But pause for a moment and feel what happens inside when you stop chasing approval. Notice how your breath slows. Notice how the mind becomes still. You are not here to chase anyone. You are here to awaken again and again to your center. The most powerful thing you can offer a younger man is not more effort. It's emotional calm. It's clarity of presence. It's the kind of rooted, warm strength that only time, suffering, and wisdom can produce. And yet, this is also where many older women unknowingly give away their power. They chase youthful chemistry instead of cultivating mature energy. They try to impress rather than invite. They try to prove they are still worthy rather than embody the truth that they already are. So, let us begin from here, not with strategies of seduction, but with practices of self-remembrance. When a woman reaches a certain age, something begins to shift, not just in the body, but in the quality of awareness. Life no longer calls for the same proving, the same racing, the same thirst for recognition. What once felt urgent begins to feel optional. But there is one area where this shift can create confusion, even suffering, if not understood: the way she relates to romantic energy, especially when it flows from or toward a younger man. The experience of aging does not strip a woman of her power, it reveals it. Yet if she is unaware of her deeper value, if she begins to see her worth through the eyes of someone less experienced, less grounded, or more emotionally reactive, she will unconsciously begin to chase a reflection instead of the first thing in her essence. This is where the first error arises. An error made not out of ignorance, but out of a longing to be seen. Many older women, whether they realize it or not, begin to reshape themselves to meet the needs, moods, or even imaginations of the younger man. This reshaping is subtle. It may appear as a willingness to tolerate emotional immaturity. It may sound like laughter that doesn't come from the gut, but is offered like currency. It may look like rearranging one's schedule, needs, even boundaries, in order to seem more desirable. Neuroscience shows us that the human brain is wired to seek connection, especially when there is uncertainty. But the mature brain, one shaped by decades of love, loss, failure, and resilience, has something far more valuable than the instinct to connect. It has the capacity to witness. And it is this witness, this steady internal observer, that an older woman must not betray. Let's pause here and consider the mechanism behind this tendency to reshape the self. When a younger man enters the space, his energy often carries excitement, spontaneity, unpredictability. These qualities can stir forgotten parts of a woman, desires that have long been tucked away beneath responsibility, caretaking, or societal expectation. And there is nothing inherently wrong with these awakenings. In fact, they can be beautiful. The danger lies in how these awakenings are handled. When the older woman begins to use the younger man's attention as proof of her desirability, she begins to make small sacrifices of her time, her silence, her stillness, her needs. At first, these feel harmless. She answers the late night call. She listens with patience, even when she feels unseen. She silences her voice just a little in order to keep the peace. But these small sacrifices, over time, accumulate. They become a pattern. And once a woman begins to compromise her inner balance to maintain someone else's approval, she is no longer relating. She is surviving. A short story illustrates this truth. There was a woman, 52 years old, who began dating a man of 28. He was charming, attentive, and made her feel youthful. He often told her that she had a young soul, and he admired her energy. At first, she felt revived. She wore colors she hadn't touched in years. She smiled more. But slowly, she noticed herself becoming restless. When he didn't reply to her texts quickly, her mind spun with questions. When he spoke of his future, it rarely included her. And still, she gave more. One evening, after cooking his favorite meal and waiting over an hour for him to arrive, he cancelled. No explanation, just a brief apology. She sat in silence at the table, looking at the flickering candle, and something inside her broke. But not in a loud way, in a quiet, irreversible way. She realized that in trying to feel wanted, she had slowly abandoned her own stillness. Psychology teaches us that when self-worth becomes entangled with external validation, especially in romantic dynamics, the nervous system begins to adapt in unbalanced ways. The body stays alert for signs of rejection. The mind begins to ruminate. Emotional availability becomes a currency to earn, not a gift to share. But the truth is, the older woman's power is not in matching the pace or emotional expression of a younger man. Her strength lies in her ability to remain grounded when others are scattered, to remain calm when others are reactive, to remain present when others are distracted. When a woman remembers who she is, truly, quietly, and fully, she no longer shapes herself to fit into the container of a younger man's expectations. She becomes the space in which he may expand or reflect, but never control. It is here that we begin to see a deeper layer of self-mastery, to know what you feel and to allow it without clinging, to know what you need and to hold it sacred, to know what you are worth, even when someone else has not yet developed the capacity to see it. This brings us to the second layer, one that often hides beneath the first: the tendency to perform rather than to be. Performing, in this context, is not theatrical. It is subtle. It happens when a woman speaks a little more sweetly than she feels, when she laughs a little longer than the joke deserves, when she agrees to something that doesn't sit quite right, just to maintain the illusion of harmony. Eastern philosophy reminds us that what is natural sustains. That which is performed always requires energy to maintain. In relationships, especially with younger partners, many older women fall into the trap of trying to earn love instead of receiving it. They become the provider of stability, the emotional compass, the source of care, and in doing so, they begin to confuse being loved with being needed. But love is not a performance. Love is not a transaction. Love is a recognition. The woman who forgets this will find herself over-functioning. She will give more than is asked, tolerate more than is fair, and eventually feel resentment where there was once joy. A woman once told the story of her relationship with a younger man who often struggled with emotional regulation. When he felt overwhelmed, he withdrew or lashed out. She, with her years of insight, tried to soothe him, explain away his behavior, rationalize his pain. She thought, if I can just love him better, he will change. She became the caretaker, the emotional translator, the therapist. Over time, her body began to show signs of fatigue. She had trouble sleeping. Her digestion faltered. Her voice grew quieter. And still, she believed that love meant staying. What she did not see was that love, when not rooted in mutual presence, becomes a silent burden. Her performance of understanding did not create transformation. It created dependency. The path of wisdom is not about withholding love. It is about offering it without self-erasure. You do not need to prove your value by carrying the emotional weight of another. In fact, when you do, you interrupt their opportunity to grow. Just as a sapling must sway with the wind to strengthen its roots, a younger man must experience the edges of his emotional capacity without being rescued. When a woman stays in her presence, without over-explaining, Without trying to make herself smaller or softer than she truly is, she becomes not a mother figure, not a savior, but a mirror. And in that mirror, a younger man may begin to see the difference between temporary chemistry and lasting depth. Neuroscience supports this. Mirror neurons in the brain reflect the emotional state of those we are close to. If you remain steady, compassionate, and boundaried, you offer the blueprint of emotional regulation. You do not need to teach it with words. Your presence does it for you. But if you perform peace while internally suffering, the nervous system picks up the contradiction. And instead of modeling stability, you unknowingly model suppression. There is a kind of power that speaks with no voice, teaches with no lesson, and gives without depletion. It is the power of presence. When an older woman remembers this, she stops trying to impress. She begins to invite him into a deeper space of relating. Invite him into emotional maturity. Invite him into clarity, not because she demands it, but because she embodies it. This path is not always easy. It requires vigilance of the self. It requires pausing before responding. It requires noticing when the urge to perform arises and choosing stillness instead. Over time, this becomes natural. It becomes the atmosphere she lives in. And within that atmosphere, the right people will stay. Not because she did more, but because she did not abandon herself. When a woman carries herself with grounded self-respect, it is felt, even without words, especially without words. There is nothing more powerful than a woman who is rooted, who does not chase, does not beg, does not bend for attention. She may bend in love, in play, in tenderness, but never in fear. Fear of being replaced, fear of being too much, fear of being alone. These fears dissolve when the woman remembers that her value does not come from being chosen. It comes from choosing herself first, not in selfishness, but in alignment. This is not about building walls. It's about building clarity. The kind of clarity that sees the difference between care and performance, between presence and pleasing, between connection and attachment. A younger man may come with energy, with curiosity, with hunger. Let that energy meet your stillness. Let his movement find your grounded rhythm. Do not rush to match him. Do not run to keep up. Walk as you are. The right man will adjust his pace, not because you demanded it, but because your presence invited it. And even if he doesn't, especially if he doesn't, you will know that you have not betrayed yourself. This is the beginning of true connection, where both remain who they are, where no one shrinks, where love is not a shape you squeeze into, but a space you expand within. The space begins with you. The rhythm begins with you. Let it be slow. Let it be deep. Let it be true. There is a quiet dignity in slowing down. In a world obsessed with movement, fast answers, instant attraction, urgent connection, there is a deep, unspoken wisdom in choosing stillness. And yet, this is where many older women unintentionally disconnect from their deepest strength when relating to a younger man. They try to match his speed, his spontaneous energy, his emotional urgency, his hunger for novelty. But the value of the woman is not in her ability to keep up. It is in her ability to stay still without being left behind. The nervous system of an older adult operates differently. The body no longer thrives on chaos. The mind, when trained through years of observation and experience, prefers clarity over constant stimulation. Yet when a younger man enters her life, brimming with unpredictable energy, many women unconsciously begin to chase his rhythm, not physically, but emotionally. She begins to text back faster. She begins to say yes when no would serve her peace better. She begins to allow disruption to her schedule in order to appear available, flexible, fun. But what she may not see is that in adjusting her natural pace, she is abandoning her greatest gift. The body has its own intelligence. It remembers everything. Every time a woman rushes her own process, whether in conversation, intimacy, or decision-making, her body sends her quiet signals. Shallow breathing, slight fatigue, a sense of misalignment. She may ignore them at first. After all, she feels alive again. But that aliveness can become agitation if it is not anchored. The younger man is not to blame for this pattern. His energy is simply different. He may not yet have learned the value of silence. He may not yet understand that urgency and intimacy are not the same. He may seek connection through stimulation because he has not yet touched the depth of stillness that can only be found with time. And in his presence, the older woman begins to doubt her natural rhythm. But wisdom does not shout, it whispers. When a woman is deeply rooted in her inner world, she becomes like a mountain, stable, immovable, quietly magnificent. The younger man may come and go like wind, like weather, like seasons. But she does not adjust her landscape to accommodate temporary storms. This does not mean she becomes rigid or indifferent. It means she becomes discerning. She allows space for connection without surrendering her internal compass. There was a woman, 55 years old, who had spent most of her life in service to others. She had raised children, cared for aging parents, and finally, after years of solitude, found herself attracted to a man 20 years younger. He was energetic, impulsive, full of ideas. He admired her grace, her depth, her calmness. At first, she found his presence intoxicating. He reminded her of the vitality she had forgotten. But slowly, she began to feel overwhelmed. He would call at odd hours. He wanted to travel spontaneously. He questioned why she needed time alone after emotionally intense conversations. And without realizing it, she began to shift. She began to suppress her need for quiet. She said yes when her body whispered no. She smiled when she was tired. She agreed when she felt uncertain. One afternoon, after returning from a weekend trip that had exhausted her, she sat in the garden with her tea, and tears began to flow. Not from heartbreak, but from self-betrayal. She realized she had been chasing youth, not because she feared age, but because she feared being left behind by someone she found exciting. But excitement, she came to understand, is not the same as nourishment. When a woman allows herself to move at the pace of her soul, not the pace of someone else's expectations, she brings a different kind of energy to the relationship, one that is magnetic, one that teaches without teaching, one that regulates without control. From a physiological standpoint, the older nervous system prefers regulation over reaction. It thrives in environments where emotions are processed with care, where decisions are made from the body, not just the mind. Younger partners may still be learning how to feel deeply without reacting quickly. They may confuse attention with intimacy. They may mistake movement for meaning. This is where the older woman must become the balance. Not by mothering, not by teaching, not by managing, but by living her truth without apology. Let him run. Let him explore. Let him move in spirals and circles and zigzags, but do not follow unless your steps are aligned with your soul. Let your energy be like deep waters, mysterious, calm, alive, but still. The kind of depth that makes someone stop, not the kind that chases to be seen. This leads to the second layer of misalignment that often appears in such relationships, the temptation to become the caretaker. There is something deeply ingrained in many women, especially those raised to believe that love means sacrifice. The desire to care becomes a role, to fix, to guide, to help, to nurture. And when a younger man enters the picture, someone still developing his emotional tools, someone still learning how to self-regulate, that desire to help often becomes an unconscious shift into parenting. It may begin innocently. She offers advice. She provides support. She forgives the outbursts, understanding where they come from. But over time, she starts managing his moods. She anticipates his needs. She softens her truth to avoid triggering him. She becomes the emotional container for his process. And slowly, the relationship becomes imbalanced. She becomes responsible for his healing. He becomes dependent on her stability. And what started as attraction becomes entanglement. In psychology, this is called overfunctioning. One partner begins doing the emotional labor for two, and the other, without malice, becomes passive. Growth is postponed. Responsibility is outsourced, and intimacy loses its equilibrium. There was another woman, early 60s, who had been dating a man in his early 30s. He had a gentle heart, but lacked emotional discipline. When conflicts arose, he shut down. He would disappear for days, then return with apologies and vulnerability. She welcomed him back each time, believing that love meant patience. But with every return, she felt a little more hollow. Not because she didn't love him, but because she realized she was carrying the entire emotional weight of their bond. She had become his guide, his anchor, his mother. And in doing so, she had lost her own need for reciprocity. Eastern philosophy teaches that true guidance is never forced. The river does not drag the rock, it flows around it. And through time, it shapes the landscape, but it never loses itself. In the same way, a woman's wisdom must be offered through boundaries, not control, through presence, not performance, through stillness, not sacrifice. A boundary is not a wall, it is a rhythm. It is the natural beat of your life, your breath, your inner timing. When you live in rhythm, those who enter your life must adjust. Not because you demand it, but because your pace is clear. If he is immature, let your maturity be silent, not smothering. If he is impulsive, let your steadiness be your mirror, not your burden. If he is struggling, let your compassion be clean, free from guilt, free from pressure, free from the need to fix. This kind of self-containment is not cold. It is conscious. It says, I love you, but I will not parent you. It says, I support you, but I will not silence myself to keep you comfortable. It says, I will hold space, but I will not carry what is yours to carry. Such boundaries may feel unfamiliar at first, especially for women who were taught to equate worth with service. But when practiced, they create the space for real connection, a connection where both individuals remain accountable for their own growth, where intimacy becomes a dance, not a therapy session. And from a psychological standpoint, this is essential. Adults in emotionally healthy relationships regulate themselves. They take responsibility for their triggers. They grow in the presence of one another, not through dependence, but through mutual reflection. The older woman must become the guardian of this kind of connection. She must be fierce with her energy, not in anger, but in clarity. Her no must be as sacred as her wise. Her silence must be a choice, not a retreat. Her presence must never be used as a cushion for someone else's avoidance. This is not about withholding love. It is about protecting the integrity of love, because love without boundaries becomes obligation. And obligation is not fertile ground for intimacy. There is a quiet moment every woman must meet within herself. The moment she realizes she can no longer be everything for everyone, that her energy is not infinite, that her emotional clarity must be preserved like a sacred flame, especially in a relationship where the other is still learning how to light their own. In such moments, stillness becomes strategy, clarity becomes kindness, and wisdom becomes the bridge between two different emotional timelines. When a woman embodies this, something remarkable happens. She becomes the teacher, not through instruction, but through embodiment. She becomes the invitation to depth, the example of emotional maturity, the calm in the storm. And those who are not ready to meet her there will fall away, not as a failure, but as a filtration. The younger man who remains will not do so because she made herself smaller or easier. He will stay because he has recognized something rare, an emotional environment that challenges without punishing, loves without rescuing, and gives without depletion. This is what it means to love with wisdom, not to overpower, not to adjust, not to perform, but to hold the self steady while others find their way. It is a different kind of power. Quiet, relentless, transformative, the kind of power that turns storms into reflections and chaos into calm. Let that power guide how you love. Let it shape how you stay. Let it be the rhythm you return to when the world asks you to chase what you already carry within. There is a truth that often goes unnoticed in relationships between older women and younger men. A truth that reveals itself not through the words spoken, but through the silence that follows misunderstanding. It is the quiet realization that the younger man, though full of energy, curiosity, and desire, often does not yet possess the emotional maturity to fully meet the woman where she stands. And when she forgets this truth, she begins to hope for clarity in places still shrouded in confusion. Emotional maturity is not something that arrives with good intentions. It is carved into the nervous system through experience, through mistakes made and deeply felt, through reflection and responsibility. Neuroscience tells us that the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain responsible for decision-making, emotional regulation, and impulse control, continues to develop well into a person's late 20s and early 30s. This is not a flaw, it is biology. It means that a younger man may have the desire to be present, but not the discipline. He may feel deeply, but still act impulsively. He may speak of love, but not yet understand the weight of what it asks. And here, the older woman faces a crossroads. She can either resist what is, expecting from him what time has not yet taught, or she can recognize what stands before her and become an example, not through preaching, but through presence. Many women with good hearts and open spirits make the mistake of expecting a younger man to know what he has not lived. They become frustrated when he fails to meet their emotional depth. They feel unseen when he cannot hold space for their complexity. And so, they begin to teach with words. They explain, they justify, they guide. But he does not change because transformation cannot be spoken into someone. It must be felt. When you expect emotional maturity from someone still forming their sense of self, you create a cycle of disappointment. You may find yourself repeating the same conversation, offering the same forgiveness, trying to stretch his awareness so it will finally touch yours. But this is not love. This is negotiation. This is waiting for someone to become what they are not yet ready to be. There is a story of a woman in her late 40s who found herself drawn to a man 15 years younger. He was attentive, passionate, and hungry for life. He often told her how much he admired her wisdom and calmness. But during moments of conflict, he would retreat. He couldn't handle discomfort. When she brought up something that mattered to her, something vulnerable, he would become silent or defensive. At first, she excused it as shyness. Later, she blamed herself for being too intense. And eventually, she began to explain everything, every emotion, every word, every need, as though by explaining more, she could lead him into maturity. But what she didn't see was that her over-explaining had become a substitute for boundaries, and no amount of talking could give him what he had not yet developed from within. She was trying to lead him up a mountain he hadn't chosen to climb. And so, each time he slid back, she felt it as a personal failure. But it was not her failure. It was simply misalignment. In relationships, especially between individuals at different stages of emotional development, the most powerful teaching is not what you say. It is what you embody. When you model emotional maturity, you create an environment where growth is possible, but never forced. And maturity, in its essence, is not perfection. It is presence. It is the ability to remain calm when misunderstood, to stay open without abandoning yourself, to feel fully without expecting someone else to rescue you from your emotions. The older woman, if she is grounded, becomes a living example of this kind of presence. She does not punish immaturity. She does not demand change. She simply reflects what is, and in doing so, she offers the younger man the choice to grow or to walk away. But make no mistake, modeling maturity is not the same as tolerating immaturity. This distinction must be clear. Many women stay too long, hoping their example will eventually inspire transformation. But transformation is not guaranteed. Some people will see your depth and rise to meet it. Others will see it and retreat because they are not ready. This is not a tragedy. It is a filtering process. You are not here to convince someone of your worth. You are here to live it, to breathe it, to hold it as sacred. There was another woman, a teacher in her early 50s, who spoke often of her relationship with a man in his 20s. She said he had never experienced a calm emotional environment before. His past relationships had been filled with chaos, arguments, and emotional outbursts. With her, he felt peace for the first time, but instead of embracing it, he became restless. He would start arguments to feel alive. He confused stillness with boredom, and when she responded with calm, he grew even more frustrated. One day, she asked him gently, "Why do you run when things are quiet?" And he replied, "Because quiet feels like emptiness." She realized then that his nervous system was conditioned to find safety in chaos. That her calmness, instead of soothing him, exposed the places where he was not yet able to feel peace. This is the paradox of maturity. Sometimes your steadiness is not welcomed, not because it lacks value, but because it demands that others confront what they have spent years avoiding. And here lies the great responsibility of the older woman to remain herself, even when the other cannot yet meet her there. This requires emotional discipline, the kind that doesn't chase after every feeling, doesn't react to every word, doesn't collapse under the weight of temporary distance. It is a practice, a quiet, daily choice to stay with yourself no matter who walks in or out of your life. From a psychological perspective, emotional maturity involves the integration of the self. It is the ability to recognize your own patterns, to sit with discomfort, to communicate without blame, and to take ownership of your experience without demanding that others change for your comfort. This kind of maturity cannot be taught in a conversation. It is absorbed over time, through watching, through presence, through being in proximity to someone who lives it. This is where your power lies, not in trying to accelerate his growth, but in refusing to shrink your truth to fit his limitations. If he is reactive, let your calm be the invitation, not the reaction. If he is inconsistent, let your consistency show him what it means to be grounded, not as a lesson, but as a boundary. If he is avoidant, let your clarity be your compass, not a weapon, but a mirror. Because the truth is, you cannot drag someone into maturity. You can only walk your path and let them choose whether they are willing to walk beside you. This is not detachment. This is clarity, and clarity is love in its highest form. It says, "I see you as you are, and I honor where I stand." There's a wisdom that grows inside a woman who has stopped trying to save people, who has stopped trying to turn potential into presence, who has stopped watering deserts that refuse to bloom. She learns that her love is not measured by her effort, but by her alignment. That maturity is not given, but chosen. That being available is not the same as being responsible for another's growth. And most importantly, she learns to stay open, to remain soft, but not to collapse, not to shrink, not to edit herself for the comfort of someone still learning how to feel. This is the quiet strength that cannot be taught, only lived. It is the strength of knowing that your presence is enough, that your steadiness is a gift, that your calm is a medicine, and that your maturity is not something you owe. It is something you offer and protect. In the end, it is not your job to change anyone. It is your task to remain aligned with your truth and let others reveal whether they can meet you there. If they can, you will not need to teach. You will only need to live. And if they cannot, you will not need to explain. You will only need to choose peace. And that peace begins the moment you stop expecting someone else to be further along than they are, and start honoring exactly where you are without shame, without apology, without compromise. There is a delicate line between love and self-forgetting, and it is often in relationships, especially those that awaken the hope of being deeply seen, that this line blurs the most. A woman who has lived through decades of rising and falling, giving and rebuilding, carries within her an inner library of lessons. But when she meets a younger man whose presence reawakens her longing, her radiance, her tenderness, there is a quiet temptation that stirs beneath the surface, the temptation to make this new connection the centerpiece of her identity. In the beginning, it seems harmless. She feels seen again, desired again. She smiles differently. She looks in the mirror and sees a version of herself that she thought had long been buried. And in this renewed reflection, she begins to believe that this relationship is not just a gift, it is proof. Proof that she is still wanted. That time has not diminished her, that she is still capable of stirring someone else's heart into movement. But there is a danger hidden in that belief. The moment a woman allows her relationship to become the mirror through which she defines herself, she begins to outsource her self-worth. And when worth becomes dependent on someone else's love, consistency, or admiration, the foundation beneath her begins to tremble. Not all at once, but slowly, like a structure that looks solid on the outside, but has a quiet crack forming underneath. This is not a flaw. It is a human impulse, the desire to feel significant in someone's world. Yet when that desire overtakes one's sense of self, it becomes a form of attachment that doesn't uplift but weakens. Eastern thought has always warned of this, not because love is wrong, but because identification with anything outside of oneself, whether it is a role, a title, a relationship, leads to suffering. When you cling to something as a source of identity, you lose your center. And once you've lost that, no amount of love from another can return you to yourself. There was a woman, well into her 50s, who met a younger man at a meditation retreat. He was gentle, soulful, deeply attentive. She found herself sharing stories with him that she had never voiced before. He called her radiant. He called her wise. She hadn't been called either in a long time. The connection felt rare, like two rivers converging after years of traveling alone. And so, she let herself open. She made time. She rearranged her life slowly, tenderly, to accommodate this new presence. At first, it felt expansive, but then the shift began. She found herself waiting longer for his messages. She adjusted her words to avoid sounding too intense. She stopped mentioning the discomforts she felt when his behavior was inconsistent. She began to imagine a future that he had never spoken of. And when he began to retreat, gradually, gently, but unmistakably, she felt not just hurt, she felt erased. Not because he had truly taken something from her, but because she had placed her sense of self in his hands, hoping he would protect it. It is not the falling in love that causes this pain. It is the forgetting of self while doing so. When a woman makes her relationship the measure of her value, she opens herself to a kind of suffering that has nothing to do with heartbreak and everything to do with self-abandonment. The most painful goodbyes are the ones that echo with our own silence. where we realized that somewhere along the way, we stopped speaking up for ourselves, stopped honoring our own rhythms, stopped listening to the signals of our own body. And that silence, that inner turning away, becomes the loudest source of sorrow. Psychology describes this as fusion, when two identities begin to merge in a way that causes one to lose clarity about who they are without the other. It happens subtly, especially when the emotional hunger for connection is stronger than the foundation of self-awareness. A woman who enters a relationship from a space of fullness can give, receive, adjust, and bend without ever losing herself. But a woman who enters from emptiness or past depletion is more vulnerable to confusing connection with completion. There's a saying, you cannot love someone into being who you need them to be. And the inverse is equally true. No one can love you into becoming whole if you are not already rooted in your own ground. Relationships are not sanctuaries for healing wounds we refuse to touch on our own. They are mirrors. They reflect what is already there, both the light and the shadow. If you build your identity around someone else's presence, you will fear their absence more than you cherish their presence. And fear, in any form, corrupts the soil of real intimacy. The gift of maturity is perspective. A woman who has lived knows that emotions come in waves. She knows that feelings, while valid, are not always reliable. She knows that her essence does not vanish just because someone stops looking at her, but that knowing must be practiced, especially in the face of deep attraction. There's a difference between loving someone and becoming consumed by them. The first allows you to grow. The second demands that you shrink. In one story shared quietly during a women's circle, a woman in her 60s told of how she had finally reconnected with a man she had loved in her youth, now much younger than her, though they were both adults. The reunion felt poetic, almost cosmic. They laughed like children. He called her his anchor. She called him her muse. But over time, the poetry faded and real life arrived. He struggled with responsibility. He needed space often. He said things like, "You ground me, but I'm not ready for this kind of depth." And still, she stayed. Not because he was giving what she needed, but because she had made him the symbol of her emotional rebirth. She told herself, "This is the last time I'll feel this alive." And that belief kept her clinging long after her peace had left the room. What we often fail to see is that intensity is not always love. Sometimes it is recognition of past longing, of unmet needs, of forgotten dreams. And when those inner stirrings awaken, it's easy to project onto the person who stands before us, believing that they are the source of our light. But no one is the source. Others may reflect, may inspire, may even ignite something. But the fire has always been ours. When a woman forgets this, she hands over the matchbox. She waits for him to keep her lit, to keep the warmth alive. And when he falters, as all humans do, she feels extinguished. But the truth is he only held a mirror. She was always the flame. This is not a lesson in detachment,